Okay, good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
So I wasn't even sure we should have a show today, a conversation. And part of it is just because, so much of the political banter in the newspapers and in my friends is just kind of snarky or gotcha politics or aha moments or talking about stuff we don't know about, the Mar-a-Lago stuff. And yes, there are some filings the Department of Justice has done, and I guess yeah, there is some information to hang on, but it just seems like all it is conjecture and snarky, bitter. And by the yes, I know I've been involved in politics a long time. You go, John, like it wasn't that way in the 80s. Yeah, kind of was, but it's different. There's something going on today that I just don't understand. And maybe it's because everybody has a megaphone. But that's just part of the reason I didn't want to have a show today. But here's the other reason I actually did want to have a conversation to get your big term perspective. I'm actually fairly optimistic. I have a ton of political friends. Shocking. I've been professionally involved in politics for 40 years. Well, so it makes sense that I would know a lot of political friends across the political spectrum. And so it makes sense that I see a lot of that snarky, bitter. I mean, some of them are making their living, throwing elbows at the other team. I just don't think most Americans are snarky and bitter and angry and prone towards violence. And even if they say they're ready to have a civil war, I don't think they mean that. And part of this is reflections with you. I don't think you think they mean it either, even if they answer a pollster that they're ready to go to war against their fellow man or fellow American citizen. I don't get it. But one more thing, there are some pretty bad things out there. I don't get Putin. And I don't get the American defenders of Putin. To me, it seems like it's a fairly cut and dried situation. There are authoritarians out there. So I do think there's real world issues. So anyway, I'm vacillating between pessimism and optimism, and I'm choosing optimism. Now, you give your preface of what's your view of the world in context of the elections and in context that you're a history professor. I've spoken way too long. I'm going to have a series of questions about topics of the day, but why don't you talk about what you'd like to talk about for a little bit?
I guess what I'm hoping for is that it seems like people are approaching their social media feeds with a little bit more sophistication in this sense. The voices that we hear are more shrill, but what is happening is that each one of those social media feeds is actually getting smaller and smaller. And so what seems to be happening, it's almost like we were given this drug, like methamphetamines when they first came out, and before anybody realized, oh, this could be dangerous, people were just popping these pills, and then you realize, like, oh, there's a real downside to this. So I think one of the things that one of the things that is somewhat encouraging is that the media environment is coalescing again. It became fragmented, and then it was zooming from place to place, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and now TikTok, which is its own set of problems. But in terms of how Americans get information, I think we are entering into a new media environment that might end up being better. And I think it's going to be more centered around what these streaming services look like, and even more so with things like YouTube. YouTube has been running a lot more ads lately, and they're getting more annoying. And I think people are eventually going to settle on paying for things. And once you start paying for things, they get better. So, and people are already doing it. They're already saying, I'm willing to pay for Peacock or Hulu or whatever.
So we subscribe to like 5 or 6 of those things.
Yeah, exactly. And you're not getting your radicalized, insane news from, the news feed from Hulu, right? And so I just tend to think that it's going to revert. It's just going to coalesce again in a somewhat more sane balance once people are paying for media again, and it isn't driven by um, the sort of ad and click driven media.
So there was a friend, and they are a friend. I went to high school with them, and then the other friend is a real friend. I think it was a business acquaintance. One on the left and one on the right, and both said a very snarky, mean-spirited thing towards the entire Democratic Party, and the other one towards the entire Republican Party. And if it wasn't real world, I know them. I go, "Are you sure you want to be so mean-spirited?" And of course, some of their weirdo friends, like, "You don't understand how evil Trump is," or "You don't or the other side, and maybe they have no idea who I am. And actually, I kind of looked at it just with a little bit of, I don't know, grace, whatever. Because really, I'm talking to their friend, and plus, I just don't think it's healthy. So maybe they'll pause a little bit, maybe they won't. Maybe I'll pause a little bit on some of my more mean-spirited things. When we subscribe and pay for things, will we not become more siloed towards, you and I both listen to Jonah Goldberg and David French, and then all my liberal friends are going to listen to George Will. That was a joke. But won't we become more siloed and not even know what's going on in the real world? Because I think a lot of my political activist friends really have no clue that 40 to 60% of the rest of the country disagrees with them. They just are in their own little world.
Yes, but these problems also tend to kind of work themselves out. I was thinking about this. You want me to say something really provocative and seemingly insane?
Well, as long as it's optimistic. If it bums me out, then no.
Well, I think in the long term it is optimistic. I was teaching, slavery, as I do every semester, and one of the things, and some students were, really good students this semester, and they were asking me some really provocative questions. And one of them that really got me going last week was the student was asking about what slavery did to the South economically. And I started thinking about the economic growth and immigration patterns of the North, because if you look at what, slavery did have some economic growth, it was profitable enough, but it was nothing compared to what was taking place in the northern states and the trade relationship that was growing between the United States and Britain during the same period. So, you have the economy of the North just taking off like a rocket, and the economy of the South just kind of limping along. The people of the South thought that the North was stealing from the South because they thought that wealth came from extracting natural resources from the ground and the selling of commodities, but not understanding that wealth creation comes from trade, not from extracting natural resources from the ground. At any rate, what I'm getting to is that people vote with their feet, and what's happening in the United States right now is that places like California and New York, people are leaving, and they're going to places like Texas and Florida and Tennessee. And the result of this is that, and everyone hates this, right? Colorado, everyone in Colorado hates everyone from California. I remember that from when I lived there, right? Yep. And that was back in the 90s, right? So if they hated them in the 90s, I bet it's just at a fever pitch now.
Now we just feel overrun. Now we just feel like we've lost.
Yeah.
But I happen to still like Colorado, but a lot of my friends think we've just lost. We are California now without the ocean.
Yeah, trust me. And there is this inclination. The downside of it is always like Californians bring their bad ideas with them. We destroyed our state, so now let's destroy yours. But that typically is not what happens, because what you get is a period of adjustment where you learn from each other. And Colorado is not a prison. You know, you can come and go as you please. And Florida is not a prison, and California is not a prison, and Texas is not a prison. And so people will just say, enough, I've had enough and I'm leaving. And the long-term effects of this is to moderate our system and keep it dynamic. And again, the only way that we that we ruin this process is if we throw money at the problem instead of examining the problem. Oh yeah, people from Utah also dislike California too. But you know, but in both the cases, let me tell you, as somebody from
Thanks,
California,
Jake. I'm trying to have somewhat optimism, and Jake, you're not helping.
But you know, if I think about what it is that's so amazing about Utah and Colorado when I go to visit there, everything is new and everything just has investment dollars thrown at it, which of course makes prices high. But the other thing is everything is nice. You know, it's really if when everything is brand new and nice, you know, nobody's saying I hate these glorious new gorgeous buildings and the rehabbed office spaces and how beautiful all of the buildings look right now, you know. But that's all investment money that's coming as a consequence of this growth. So yeah, you might resent the crowds, but you know, there's some good that comes along with it. In both
Russell Wilson. So as you know, I was just up in well, the great what is that? The peninsula out there outside of Seattle. And so we toured Seattle for a day, and it's a liberal bastion. And I know about their minimum wage laws that drove every fast food restaurant out of Seattle proper. I get that. In fact, I didn't see any. So to me, that kind of resonated. Still a beautiful city, though. I thought Seattle was really cool. So, yeah. I mean, sure, it's, yeah, thanks, the Olympic Peninsula. But, you know, so yeah, California is horrible, but it's not going to stop being a major powerhouse for decades, right? Or forever, right? It is.
Yes. But at a certain point, we have to grapple with a bunch of very privileged people who are trying to hold on to their privilege. And we shouldn't be shocked when people try to do that. But I always think, you know, if you're a rich person living in LA or San Francisco, slavery should make sense to you. You know, you should understand.
That's provocative. Is that the provocative thing you were going to say?
Yeah, right. Slavery should make sense to you because you're trying to hold on to your plantation and you don't want things to change because you don't want to do anything that might threaten the thing that has created your privilege. And meanwhile, if you're one of the sort of regular people, you want nothing to do with this because you can't compete with the rigged system. So you want to go somewhere where you're going to have a fair chance to succeed. And where they're going to go is places like Utah and Colorado and Florida and Texas. And they're not going there. They're going there because they are fleeing a system of privilege that they don't want to try to compete with. So I guess that took me a long time to get to my controversial statement, but that's what I mean when I say, if you're a rich person who owns a $5 to $10 million house in LA or San Francisco, no one should have to explain to you why plantation owners fought so hard to maintain the system that benefited them. You know, it's
so maybe you're kind of getting at the crux of this animosity between the haves and have-nots, and it's not in traditional lines necessarily between Republicans and Democrats. Or
no, it's funny because for as much as like the left goes on and on about, you know, attacking privilege, they really don't. You know, because you can get away with attacking privilege on the cheap by saying all of the right things. But I mean, it's there's, you know, I'm sure we've all heard the expression NIMBYism, all right, not in my backyard. Everyone wants to preserve what they have, but when you fight so hard to preserve unearned privilege, it's going to have a distorting effect on the world around you.
So Professor, on that point, and then let's go to a couple more current events. This is helpful. Thank you. It was one of my aha moments when I was elected as a commissioner as a young man. I found that even though the Republican Party platform said, "Hey, we believe in private property rights and whatever the zoning allowed, somebody should be able to do with what their property that they wanted to." Hell no, baby. Net NIMBY stuff. It didn't matter how Republican or how conservative you are. If you owned a single family property and an apartment was going up, everybody was against it. Throw R&D left and right out the window. They were happy to have, to your words, privilege to keep the status quo. They didn't care if somebody had the right to develop that property. Hell no, BS. We're not going to do that, and we're going to throw whatever elected officials are willing to do it out of office if necessary. Correct or no?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't exclude myself from this. There's a property behind my house. I'm in the middle of like a potential lawsuit right now over the development that took place behind my own home. So, physician, heal thyself. But
Okay.
but the downstream effects of this are almost impossible to ignore. I mean, especially when it comes to housing policy in California, is just completely absurd. But not just housing; it's really the big infrastructure policies of California are so enmeshed in protecting privilege that it makes it impossible, or I shouldn't say impossible, but it makes it very difficult for someone who does not come from a privileged background to take part in the system. And the only thing you can really do if you're a sort of normal person is leave, because you just can't compete. The institutions of privilege are just far too. And so it drives me nuts, I guess I would say, like, this is when people who look at the admissions at elite colleges, look at the system of higher ed. These are all systems of privilege that benefit a certain class of people that nobody will really take substantial steps to undo. They will only take symbolic steps, things that make they'll use radical language in order to avoid fundamentally ensuring that a meritocracy could take place. I mean, they attack the very idea of a meritocracy, and in doing so, it just so happens that they create a system that will make sure that their own children can benefit.
Right, have the same privileges they had.
Right.
Okay, so Professor, let me take you through a series of questions, and in no particular logical order, so forgive me. It was such a beautiful day in Colorado, I ran more on the Highline Canal than instead of writing down some questions in order.
My hair's still wet from my swim, so
yeah, we're on the same page. I put on a hat instead of dressing up. So we've had a conversation on almost all these, and at some point I'd be curious to find out if you think we haven't had a conversation on major topics of the day. We've had guns, abortion, gays, budget, international relations, the Civil War, race relations. I mean, we've gone through a bunch of different topics. And so I'm trying to think of whether we're actually having real conversations about real problems in America today for this November election, and then setting it up for 2 years from now. And the answer is, I kind of think we are, in a weird, perverse way. It's not an authentic, direct conversation. DeSantis goes to Texas and finds some people and sends them up to Martha Vineyards. And I don't think that's a good thing, by the way. But it does have us talking about immigration, which I do think is a good thing. And so we're doing it in an indirect way. In Colorado, we have a U.S. Senate candidate for the first time in my memory, who believes that DACA kids should have a path to citizenship as a Republican. And he also thinks that that abortion should be legal for the first 5 months. And he publicly said that before the primary, and he's saying it on TV today. In my lifetime, I've never seen a Republican candidate say that so straightforward things to me that even though I was in the minority of the party, I thought I supported candidates who were pro-life and anti-immigration because I like their other issues. So I kind of think the system's working in Colorado, that we're having this mashing of ideas and we get to have a legitimate choice for US Senate and governor. Who's much more conservative. And, so we get these gnashing of teeth. How about California or nationally? Are we going to be happy with the US Senate? Are we going to be happy with the US House? Is Roe v. Wade a good thing that was overturned? Because at least we can have an authentic conversation about abortion. Everybody seems to think it's evil and we should hate our fellow man now. I kind of think it's a good thing, although unpleasant. It's awkward. Yeah, it's still good. We get to control our own destiny. What do you think?
I try to remind myself that democracy will break your heart 49 out of 100 times, and it gets really dispiriting when it happens 48 times in a row. And I every time I think California has reached the breaking point where common sense must, come in at some point, I am astounded yet again when it doesn't happen. And it's hard to try to, because we each live in our own kind of communities and we have our own separate lives. It's hard not to generalize based on your own experiences. So I try to break out of my bubble and talk to people from all over the country. And I would say outside of California, yeah, there seems to be some shaking loose that's taking place. And I've always found that at least in my own experiences, if you just come out and say, if this happens all the time in politics, people say, oh, you're going to be dead if you say this. And then you point out, well, 70% of Republicans believe this. How can it be political suicide to say something that 70% of Republicans believe when I'm running as a Republican? And then one person gets up and says it, and then you realize, like, oh my gosh, look at that. We had a very noisy 10% that were intimidating another 20%, and it was scaring the 70%. I saw this happen on issue after issue after issue, because there would be stuff that happened at the state party level where you would think, oh, this is going to be very controversial, and then it would go before the party in general, and the issue wouldn't even be close. I remember there was a resolution on something having to do with gay rights, and it was like, oh, this is going to be so close, and we have to really campaign and make sure we did all. And when it came to a final vote, during the speaking portion, when you're hearing for and against, you're like, oh my gosh, this is going to be 49-51, and who knows, it's a coin toss which way it's going to go. And then the vote was taken, and it was more like 95-5. It wasn't even close. And
so would you say that misinterpretation of media and vitriol and the Kansas thing regarding abortion, that seemed to surprise everybody? A very conservative state with very conservative legislatures constantly narrowing the window of when abortion could be allowed. But then there's a court case that said you can, it's constitutionally protected. And should we allow that to be overturned? And 70% of Kansas said no. Well, is that your point? Is that we argue about?
I just think that it's hard to stay, but you have to stand up to bullies, and realize that it takes that once somebody with a little bit of common sense who doesn't say, well, what we need is another bully, but for my side. But somebody who stands up and says, like, well, no, I disagree with all of that, and instead, here's what I would advocate. And then you say the three things that you're for. And what often happens is, yeah, that one bully will sulk and be bitter, but there's almost always a desire among 65-70% of the people to say, oh, okay, well, yeah, if there's a reasonable alternative, I'll take it. But if nobody stands up to the bully, the bully just gets to run with it. And normal people have these conversations behind closed doors so often.
Yeah.
And you just think,
I agree.
why aren't we and this is something we say about liberals all the time, so let's turn this on conservatives too. You need to preach what you practice. This is something that we always accuse liberals of doing. You say, oh, well, you live a very conservative lifestyle, but you won't come out and say that this is what you would recommend for a good life. And for all my conservative friends who rightly point out that hypocrisy among liberals, it's time to pull that mirror out, shine a spotlight on all the times when conservatives aren't preaching what they practice. If you are a moderate, a kind person with moderate inclinations, you need to begin preaching that. You can't just practice it. You have to, because what you'll find is that once somebody stands up and, just as you said with this candidate you had in mind, once somebody stands up and says it, then it's easy to show that the emperor has no clothes.
You're optimistic that America is still a going concern, and our illiberal, well, no, it's liberal. What is the word? What are we? We're not. Well, I always say constitutional republic, but you say we're a liberal.
An ideological nation state.
You do say that.
Based on classical liberalism.
Classical liberalism. That's what I was.
Pluralism. Yeah.
Pluralism. Yeah. Are we still a going concern, or are there some things that we should be really nervous about?
There are always things that we should be really nervous about, and the thing that we should be the most nervous about is people not making the case for classical liberalism. I mean, we've seen this in other times in American history. The biggest challenge to classical liberalism is when people who understand that classical liberalism is the thing that produces the best result for humanity, and they won't say it.
But isn't it? Well, I know we could wind our whole way on this conversation, but isn't it currently most dangerous among conservatives or nouveau conservatives or whatever right now? And I know you'll get right into the heart attack cancer thing. I get it, but it's really on both sides that are this horrible piercing pincing maneuver that could hurt our system or our humanity.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
But it's equally bad, I guess, or in different ways.
Well, not just equally bad. I just think it's even a false choice to pretend that they're not the same thing. I mean,
okay.
I wouldn't equate a congressman with the president, but I would say that anybody who thinks that like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is somehow not as offensive as Lauren Boebert, then that's probably your bias, right? Well, hold on, that's a pretty low bar. She's probably not quite as bad as Lauren Boebert, but she's pretty close. If you think there's a giant gap in between those two people, or if you think that they're doing something that is different, you're mistaken. What they're doing is the same. It's not, and there is no discernible ideological difference between these two people. They they believe in the use of power and the destruction of the American system of government. And to me, that's the most important distinction. Is I put them in the same category. I don't say, oh, here's, this person's on the right and this person's on the left. I know, to me, they're just the same thing. They're people who believe in the use of power and the destruction of pluralistic government. Like, they sound different. they pander to different audiences.
So I'm going to skip a bunch of questions and just ask you this one then. How do we get more American citizens to understand their true power, that they vote with their feet, but they can make a more important difference than just leaving? Which is also cool, by the way. If you want to go to some other place, that's actually cool. I like that. But so I'm not even saying it's a negative, but shouldn't we vest our citizenship in something more better than just power and money or abuse? And I mean, can't we be optimistic? Can't we just be fun, spirited, loving people arguing for our best cause? And when we lose the election, we got to figure out how to do better next time. I don't get, it seems like we're in a dangerous little situation right now where we seem to want to hate and resent rather than love and forgive. And I'm not even saying this from some liberal way. I'm saying it from a conservative way. I just don't get it, where we're coming from.
I mean, to me, I think that Jake Peterson and Bart Miller should both be on an elected board of some kind. They should be on the board of trustees for their local college. They should be on the board. I mean, whatever your local college is, there's an elected board of trustees. Right. and there's and for your local school board, like, you should run for school board, but really these boards of trustees, when you have people who actually pay attention, it's remarkable how much influence they have over or could have, because in many cases they end up just sort of rubber stamping whatever comes from the state, or you copy whatever everybody else is doing in order to avoid legal liability. But really smart, energetic, hardworking people should be on really boards of trust. Run for the board of something. And the other thing is, at least in California, every government is structured differently, but the committees that report to your city council are often citizen committees. Mm-hmm. And
same in Colorado.
Yeah, same in Colorado. So, okay, good. So, be on one of those, and it's usually a quarterly meeting, and something to do every month. But that level of civic engagement is. I also am a big fan of like character development. I was looking up the other day just to see what was going on with the Masonic lodges these days. I don't know if you ever do this. It's just like, I wonder how many Masons there are these days.
Yeah. Did you have an answer, or did you just start the expert?
Yeah, there is still a local chapter, and they do meet, but I didn't recognize the names of any of the leaders. I should name. There wasn't anybody I knew, at least on the leadership team. But I thought, oh, good. I'm glad they still exist. But those things create this sort of fabric of your community. And once you are, once you're married, right? Once you're getting your
congratulations. Remember, we're on Spotify now. So now Professor Toodle's compliment to Jake Peterson for getting married recently. Congratulations,
Jake. Yeah. And you start building your life together, and I think one of the things that is kind of nice is to carve out a life where just a tiny part, don't let it overwhelm your personal life or your spiritual life, but to carve out just a little tiny portion for your involvement in the community, because every one of these places is desperate for leadership. And I don't mean leadership and being told what to do kind of leadership, but just leadership in the sense of just people who will show up and throw a couple brain cells at a problem.
Yeah, that's so true. Love that. So, Professor, let's talk about a quick topic. The confidential documents that supposedly the former president has formerly had in his possession. I don't think I blogged on it. I don't think I particularly talked about it. Not that I'm not interested. I actually think it's pretty interesting, the power of the president and classification. It's an interesting argument. I just happen to be pretty optimistic that our system is working. The legislature investigates, the courts rule. There's a court appointed person. They appoint a special master and appeal. The Department of Justice appeals. An appellate court overrules, and the process continues. It's kind of like, oh, cool. Our founders were brilliant. I mean, they're figuring this out, and we can get on with our lives and our families. And I guess if we want to rant on Facebook, we can, or bring it up in a conversation like this, we can. But it really, I'm throwing some brain cells at it, but I don't.
Your audio just cut out for a second there. Right after you said I'm throwing some brain cells at it, but I think you said you're not letting it overwhelm your life. Was that your general point? Yes, I still can't hear you. Say something.
Keep going now. Okay. Wherever I lost you.
Okay, so and I agree with you. I think because one of the things that is happening now is that at a certain point, reality intervenes, and no matter what President Trump had said, his lawyer. I mean, this happened during the election too. You're at a certain point, a lawyer has to go to a judge and make an argument that won't get them disbarred or laughed out of court. And every time it gets to that point, President Trump's arguments fall apart because they're absurd. And the only thing that you're sort of left with, if you're a supporter of President Trump still, is you have to invent some kind of conspiracy theory for why it happened again, which is always easy to do. You can always come up with a conspiracy theory pretty quickly. It's not hard. You begin with a premise and then just, say words, right? Nothing could be easier. But I think that most reasonable people at least understand that when you explain it to them, a president can't declassify documents with his mind, as he asserted the other day. And presidents don't have magic wands. And then the other thing that I've had some success with in talking to Trump supporters about is because I've had some of them say, well, what about the unitary theory of the executive? And my argument is, yes, what about the unitary theory of the executive? But part and parcel of believing that the executive branch exists and is one thing is that we only have one president at a time. Mm-hmm. And President Joe Biden is the president of the United States right now. Even if President Trump thought that he could declassify documents with his own mind, we have records acts for how presidential papers are to be handled. And when President Trump was the president of the United States, he had a government job, and thus those materials are not his property. They belong to the people of the United States. And when I felt like one of the most, obvious arguments that just seem totally absurd is that President Trump doesn't have standing to even claim that he should get these documents back because they don't belong to him. If I were, and the analogy that I heard.
Say that in a different way, because it seems like you're making the opposite point. Say, I'm not sure I followed.
Okay, well, let me put it to you this way. If if somebody steals, I had my motorcycle stolen the other, a couple
Yeah.
months ago, right?
Yeah.
Now, the guy who stole my motorcycle can't go to court and claim that he has standing to get my motorcycle back. Because it never belonged to him. It always belonged to me. Does that make sense as an analogy?
Yeah. Another way of saying it is when Judge Cannon said that the Department of Justice can't review their own executive documents. Well, wait, what do you mean? They're my documents. How would I not be able to review my documents?
Right. Exactly. So,
Okay.
And the argument that many, and in fact, the only argument made by Trump's lawyers is kind of to deflect and say, you didn't do this to Sandy Berger, or Hillary Clinton wasn't prosecuted, or, and to which I would say, yes, those were mistakes. That's, you're not making an argument for, or I find it to be a very bizarre argument that what they did was wrong. So we should absolutely just make it right. That doesn't make any sense to me.
Right.
But yeah, you don't have standing to reclaim something when it doesn't belong to you.
Yeah. So our system's holding, our system's working, right? We should be optimistic.
Yes. I mean, because even though these are in some cases Trump judges, or Trump appointed judges, or Republican appointed judges, and in many cases, I think it's important that they still have to go to work today and say, well, you have to write part of what you have to do is you have to write this stuff down on a piece of paper and hand it to me.
Right.
And if you don't do that, then we can't move on with the process and you lose.
Right.
And if you can't find somebody to string together some sentences, then we're done. And it doesn't matter how many times President Trump goes on Hannity and uses sentence fragments. Somebody has to produce actual work, or you lose.
So in all these battles of the day, immigration, gun control, abortion, gay marriage, and on and on and on, there are winners and losers. There are people that legitimately should be, nervous or aware that the world is not as stable as they thought. Abortion or gay marriage or the ability to own a gun or on and on. But also, well, it actually is a little bit more stable than most countries. I mean, because there isn't just like a man or a woman who can get elected and just take away everything. There's all these different states and levels and branches of government fighting about it constantly. The answer is not just the answer. Somebody says they want to do something and the rest of the system goes, no, you're not.
Well, for all of the protests against the Dobbs decision, think about what its actual effect has been. It actually forces it has actually forced politicians to be responsible for what they say.
Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that what we want?
In other words, these people now have to actually be accountable for the words that are coming out of their mouths.
And so do citizens, by the way. They don't get an out either. They got to kind of choose one or the other.
Exactly. And so by the same token, what liberals love about putting the same thing that liberals love about putting Trump lawyers in front of a judge is the same thing that the Dobbs decision was forcing politicians to do all over America. That is, you now must make an argument and be accountable for your words.
And see if you get the votes or not. And let's tally them up.
Yeah.
And then we'll argue about it 2 years from now.
Yes. Absolutely.
Okay. I think that's in some convoluted way got most of my reticence of not having this conversation and desire to have it. So let's see if Bart or Jake will jump in with anything else, or I've got a couple concluding questions or remarks. Or Professor, am I missing anything? Are you wishing I would have brought up, the debt and deficit? Or are you wishing we would have brought up more about global economic order and the power of China? I mean, is there some things that we really should be talking about in regards to midterm elections?
I mean, I suppose China and Russia are always on the back burner as things that can really throw things.
But really, that's just the conversation we've had a lot about is whether you're willing to use power, authoritarian, autocratic rule. You're willing to kill people if they disagree with you. I mean, we've talked a lot about that, right? The power of violence and how that changes human behavior. I mean, that's not new, right? I mean, that's the oldest story in the human race, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
So we'll continue to talk about those. I just don't know whether we needed more about it, because I just hope that people are willing to use their words to argue.
Well, here's the only dark side that to all of this, which is that when people take advantage of the system in order to destroy the system, and
yeah,
I
explain that a little bit more.
Well, I guess I've just been really thinking about how bad the Biden administration's student loan forgiveness program is.
In comparison, the same thing to building the wall, right? They're both really bad.
Yes, in part because of how they were willing, or, the same thing happened when the Obama administration tried to regulate everything that got rained upon because they said it fell under the Waterways Act, these are, and what really makes me nervous about the student loan thing is it opens up this incredible Pandora's box of ways of abusing the law in a similar way, because it's almost like they said, well, because nobody has standing to sue, then it doesn't matter, then no one can stop us from doing this unconstitutional thing. And that is an incredibly dangerous precedent to set. To make the argument that what you're doing is unconstitutional and illegal, but there's no mechanism for stopping it, is just the most naked and absurd argument for the use of arbitrary power. It is undoubtedly, it is clever, but I don't see it as being better than the kind of stuff that Donald Trump was trying to do.
Okay. Yeah, and that's a really, you brought up, that's probably your fourth or fifth major interesting point today. So Jake, maybe you can help accumulate some of these. I'm going to interrupt you just to make sure we have time for Jake and Bart to jump in. So since you both come online, it looks like you're ready to ask a question or make a comment. Bart or Jake, who's up first? It looks like Bart's trying. Bart, you're aging yourself. Okay, there you go, Bart.
I unmuted, but I am happy to let Jake go first.
Now you're up.
Yeah, go Bart.
Okay, Jake is shaking his head. It's interesting, Professor, that you were talking about the student loan forgiveness. Procedurally, I have the same concerns you have about the way it's happening. The problem is where I get caught on this issue is I think the whole student loan operation itself has become such a boondoggle that, here, I'll give you an example of why it's a boondoggle. The way they compound the interest, it's not like your mortgage on a house, you guys, basically what they're doing is setting, young people up who don't understand how loans work. They're putting them in a position where they're never, in an ideal world, to the people who service these loans, they never can pay them off. If you make the minimum payment, all you're paying is interest. And my understanding is they actually set the minimum payment below the required amount of interest to pay off every month. So if all you're doing is making that minimum payment, you're never going to pay it off. They don't even give these kids today a fighting chance on this. When I took out student loans, it was very straightforward as what was going on. And I ultimately paid them off. And no, I didn't. This was way back in the 70s and the 80s. And maybe I had $30,000 in debt, which was a lot to me at the time. but I figured out by hook or by crook how to pay it off. The students today who take out student loans, forget it. There is no way they can understand what they're doing. And as far as I'm concerned, what the president did is kind of like, what the hell? It's all most of these loans are now held by all of us. You know, the federal government, I guess it was back in the Obama administration, basically took this whole thing over. Well, if we want to excuse some of it and say, okay, you don't have to pay off $10,000 of the debt you've taken out, who really cares? You know, I kind of object to I do think people should be financially responsible for their educations. And that's a really important thing. But just to say that, oh gosh, what's going on with this loan forgiveness thing is really, really bad. Well, yeah, procedurally, I agree with you. I don't think executive orders should be doing this, but something's got to happen with this system. It really stinks.
Yes,
and I'm an old person who's paying for the system, and I hate it.
Yeah, but you're not paying for it, Bart. Our kids and grandkids are going to pay for that debt that we now have taken out of America. So we're just taking away decisions from future generations. But I don't mean to jump in.
Yes,
it's okay.
I agree 100%. And I remember, you know, one of my friends who now works at Politico, he did some of the first reporting on this back during the Obama administration, because it was I think he was at the Washington Post at the time, but his name's Brian Failer. If you want to go out and, you know, look up articles from back when this was happening, and now he covers tax policy for Politico. And he pointed out, just as a reporter, not as an analyst, that one of the things that it was designed deliberately to be bad. So this was an argument dating back to when Obamacare was passed. They needed a way to make it look like Obamacare would balance out. And they took over the federal student loan system from private banks, because private banks were making money. And then the Congressional Budget Office could say, aha, well, we're going to make as much money as the private banks did. And then they put in order to make Obamacare look like it would balance out, it put in much higher interest rates with different mechanisms for paying them back, right? So that it would look on paper like it was going to generate all of this income for the federal government. And then the argument was, we're going to fix it before it ever happens. But of course, it was never fixed.
Yikes.
So it actually began escalating in this way, you know, pretty early on. Within about 5 years, that's when all the really bad loans started kicking in, and it was never fixed because it was part of the budget assumptions. Now, of course, here's the other thing that happens. Something that was making money making money for the federal government when it was operated by private industry now starts losing money, because they're directing at the same time to loosen the regulations to offer it to more people. So at the very same time that you are creating this horrible system for student loans, you're now giving them to everyone. And of course, colleges and unscrupulous colleges as well, however much money you can get in financial aid, that's how much they will take. And in particular, as standards lowered for bachelor's degrees, right? You throw everybody into college and you begin removing the standards for bachelor's degrees. Well, now in order to differentiate yourself, you have to go to graduate or professional school. So what ends up happening? Graduate professional school, and yes, and very expensive student loans. The difference, it is shocking. Anybody who graduated from college in, say, the 20 teens versus when I rolled into Colorado in 2004, when I was driving my car with no air conditioning into Colorado in 2004, I owed $100,000 in student loan debt.
Nice.
And the interest rate on that loan was either 1.9 or 0.9%. And my payments, I put it on a 30-year fixed, or no, I'm sorry, a 20-year fixed 1.9% loan, paying $336 a month that I still pay, and my student loans will be paid off on that schedule. But what was available to me was unavailable to everybody who came after me, precisely because the federal government took it over as part of this incredible boondoggle. But I find it, so I agree 100%. I will even criticize the system more harshly than you. I felt the same way about DACA, right? I want DACA fixed. I've supported every piece of legislation related to DACA. The bad policy and takeover always happens when it's a policy you support. It's really easy to say, if you don't support a border wall, well, of course you oppose executive power then, but it's when they're giving you something you want, something that is a good idea. That's when it's more, and it also is something that benefits you somehow personally. That's when it's hardest to oppose it and say, not if it means giving up rule of law, but that's, gosh, that's why I find the issue so fascinating, because it just hits on every single thing that gets my blood boiling, right? The original lie, the lie that said what, and I remember the arguments where they said, well, look, if we're just going to fix it later, you can't use these budget assumptions. You can't make the argument at the same time that we're gonna charge all these students all this money, and it's gonna help pay off Obamacare, and then say, but we're not actually gonna do it. And then to completely compound the problem by they would say opening up higher education, but what it really did was, it was just places like ITT, Technical Institute, and the University of Phoenix. These are the places that all of a sudden overnight became the largest holders of student loan debt, and then the Justice Department goes after them. But you've just opened up this spigot of money and turned on the fire hose and said, anybody who can hook up to this fire hose of money that's shooting out can take it all. What do you think is going to happen? When you fire up your money cannon, people are going to start showing up with nets.
So Professor and Bard, this conversation is remarkable to me, because part of that I did not know. So thank you for the correlation between Obamacare. I'd never heard of that before, and so color me ignorant. Brian
Failer, F-A-L-E-R, good reporter for Politico.
Just think it's completely fascinating how interrelated things are. So that's a pleasant surprise from this conversation. In immigration reform in general, by the way, or immigration, demographics of world population and how things are, we really need young people in America. And so does Europe more than us, and China needs it more than that. And so does Russia even more than China. It is those drivers, but we're not really talking about those issues in current political terms. So we're going to talk about that in a future show. We're way over time already, but Jake has something to add to this conversation, either a critique or a compliment or an item or a question. Jake, you're up.
Okay, so just going kind of on the student loan thread, I'm lucky enough that I was able to go through my education, including my master's degree, without taking out any student loans. That included working 65 hours a week in a movie theater during the summers. So wow. I'm not really in favor of the whole student loan thing, because I worked hard to pay it off. not have to take out any. But then my wife is a therapist. And so between the two of us, we make a decent amount of money, and we might get $20,000 in loan forgiveness, even though we don't need it. So Tootle, it goes back to what you always say of a lot of government programs that could, in theory, benefit the poor, like healthcare reform, would work if you excluded rich people from the program.
Yeah, it's very true. This is a benefit that's also mostly going to very privileged people.
Mhm.
In fact, the most privileged people in society are people with graduate degrees. The lowest unemployment rate, the highest incomes.
Yeah.
Which leads to that bitter resentment between, I guess, class structure rather than, it's just, there's a lot of anger out there. And the parties have switched.
I get it. I mean, as far as that anger goes, just on that very basic level of what Jake just described, people should be angry. This is rich people giving themselves a giant benefit.
That's going to be paid for by future generations, so we don't have the immediate pain now.
Yeah, if at all, who knows?
Well, we're going to pay for it in some way.
Some way, yeah, sometime, yeah.
All right. I still want to end in brevity with some kind of optimistic feel. I predict that there'll be some surprises in the November election, but we get what we vote for. And that's how our system should work. And we should all, and yes, there's a huge amount of money in politics, and there's a huge amount of lying in politics. And we're not talking about the real issues the way we should, but I'm not the history professor. I think that's probably happened for centuries. And so none of this is particularly new. And that gives me some confidence that we should be proud of our system, not resentful of it. Correct me however you wish, Professor, and then we'll end the show.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to get the government we deserve, and we're going to get it good and hard. We are not governed by aliens from outer space. We govern ourselves. And the first place to look is always in the mirror.
And that brings me a sense of optimism. I'm comfortable with looking in the mirror and seeing the flaws and ignoring some others and concentrating on what I'm good at and helping others. And we should figure this out together as a team. The alternative is not a good one, where we just ask for a strong man to decide things for us.
Yeah, I mean, democracy will break your heart 49 out of 100 times, but it'll also point in the right direction. It'll lead to long-term progress 51 out of 100 times.
Okay, fair enough, Jake and Bart.
He's on the
All
phone.
right.
Yeah.
Professor, thanks for your thoughts today. Really appreciate it. Hope you have a great week, and we'll likely do this next Friday, but we'll talk about it. So
Excellent.
Team, thank you. You had like 5 really good things that came out of this, Professor. Jake, somehow we got to figure out how to pull those gems out of this, because there were some really interesting thoughts on this. So thank you all, and we'll see you.